Exactly 10 years ago, to the hour, the first results were trickling in. And it was becoming apparent that something enormous had occurred. The result was on a scale that nobody had predicted. 62% of Dutch voters had rejected the European Constitution. And believe me, my friends, when I tell you that all over Europe, friends of freedom were cheering. We felt that 3 million brave Dutch citizens had cast, so to speak, proxy ballots on behalf of 500 million unconsulted Europeans. You had stood in the way of the project. For decades, closer integration had been pursued by the elites, by the corporate interests, by the bankers, the diplomats, the cartel politicians, the civil servants, the Davos men. And now, for the first time, ordinary citizens had been asked their opinion, and they gave their answer unequivocally. They'd had enough of political integration. They wanted to live as free citizens, as good neighbours, not as squabbling tenants with the other countries of Europe. It was a great night for Europe. I can't remember so many people wishing that they were Dutch, or at least wishing that they'd been involved. Is it Henry V says, "Gentlemen in England now abed shall think themselves accursed they were not here." Well, there were plenty of us feeling accursed that we were not here on the 1st of June 2005. Well, here we are, 10 years on. What has happened? Every single measure in the European Constitution has been implemented anyway, without exception. A president of Europe, a foreign minister and an army of diplomats, treaty-making powers and legal personality for the Union, an extension of majority voting, a scrapping of national vetoes. Every dot and comma of the Constitution was implemented regardless. The will of the Dutch people, and for that matter of the French people and the Irish people and all the many unconsulted peoples whose leaders were too cowardly to ask them the question, was simply swatted aside. The result of the referendum was effaced. Nothing was allowed to stand in the path of closer union. We thought for a beautiful moment that we had stopped the creature. But it's like one of those undead monsters in a horror film. You just can't kill it. European integration keeps staggering on. Whatever you throw at it, you can hammer a stake into its heart, it plucks it out and keeps going. The silver bullets can thud into the rotting flesh, it carries on, dragging itself malodorously forward. Nothing can stand in its way, neither the will of the people nor the dots and commas of the treaties. We learned two very important things on that day, or at least in the immediate aftermath of the vote in June 2005. One about the Netherlands and one about the Brussels system. What I learnt about the Netherlands is something that stayed with me ever since, and it has made me always happy to come back here. Because I'll tell you, up until then, I had always been puzzled by the apparent Euro enthusiasm of the people of this country. It seemed such a paradox, particularly if you're looking from Britain. We sometimes feel a little bit cut off from our friends and allies on the continent. I think it's, as the presenter on Buitenhof said to me yesterday, we're different, we're more attached to the other English-speaking peoples. Maybe there's an element of truth there. But if I'm honest, the one country where we feel we have some temperamental resemblance to the inhabitants is this one, which made it all the odder to see a country that apparently was so similar in its background, in its traditions, in its attachment to parliamentary democracy, in its belief in individualism and freedom and free trade, submitting itself with enthusiasm to this corporatist racket in Brussels. I particularly feel a sense of warmth and almost kinship when I come here. If I can say this, it's a very politically incorrect thing, but in Tolkienian terms, I've always felt that the Dutch are, so to speak, our Nandor, our sundered kindred, those who refused the crossing. And what I really like about this country, almost more than anything else, is that you invented modern markets, and with that, the freedom and the happiness that follows from contract and property rights. You see it every time I come here, without exception. Whenever I go to the city, I was doing it earlier today, I visit the Rijksmuseum, which since the refurbishment it's got a pretty good claim to be the nicest gallery in Europe. Maybe not the most extensive, maybe not the most impressive collection, but the best overall experience. And when I go around, I see two things. First of all, you see something that had never happened before, which is the development of markets, even in the field of art. For hundreds of years, Europeans painted to commission. There were powerful patrons, either bishops or aristocrats, and an artist would do what he was told. And we have a series of pictures that followed the same themes here as anywhere else. Descent from the Cross, Madonna with Child. And then at some stage in the 16th century, a truly miraculous thing happened in these flat, exquisite parts of Europe. People started painting without a customer. Instead of aiming up at a patron, they would aim down at the general market. There was the beginning of freedom and free trade. And what followed is what's supposed to happen in a market system. Specialization. This guy's really good at ships, so that's what he does. This guy's really good at bowls of fruit. This guy does portraits. And because that's all they're doing, they get better and better. It's the basis of the market system. And on the walls of the Rijksmuseum, you see art lifted to a level that it had not known anywhere in the world. Because instead of state patronage, there were free markets. And when you look at the faces of the people in those portraits, in the pictures by Rembrandt or by Frans Hals, those plump, peaceable, prosperous faces, over the big white collars and the black tunics and the stovepipe hats on top, you think here was a people who had learned that the best way to achieve happiness is to offer a decent service at a fair price to the people around you. When the rest of Europe was still defining its ethic in terms of sacrifice and martial glory, the Dutch had invented the sublime idea of free contract and personal autonomy. And if there is an idea that has brought so much happiness to the human race, I have yet to hear it. And this, I think, is again something we have in common. When Napoleon, who had at the time occupied this country, was grumbling about ours, he dismissed us as a nation of boutiquiers, a nation of shopkeepers. Great. What would you rather live in? A nation of generals? A nation of monks? A nation of trade union activists? A nation of civil servants? Is there anyone who provides such a service to the community as a trader selling at a fair price competitively with others and getting wealthy by giving pleasure to those around him? It's a great system. Wonderful idea, capitalism. But it did leave me thinking, how could these, of all people, have fallen for this racket in Brussels, where freedom and free trade have been pushed aside by the interests of these giant corporations, these giant corporate interests, whether trade unions or mega banks or multinational companies? How does that fit with what I like to think as the Dutch, like to think of as the Dutch ethic? Well, of course, on the 1st of June 2005, I got my answer. You didn't think that at all. It's just that, like every other country in Europe, your politicians were not representing the wishes of the people who paid their salaries. You have that in common with us, and with the French, and with the Irish, and with the Swedes, and with the Danes, and with every other country ever to have had a referendum on the issue of European integration. You get the same rift in every single case, a Euro-fanatical political class, making up all the parties, all the big business interests, and then everybody else. I remember the French referendum, which took place 3 days before yours. I remember travelling out a few months earlier to Paris, and on the train, by chance, was a friend of mine, a Green MEP, very nice man. a great Euro fanatic. And he explained to me why it was statistically impossible for the Eurosceptics to win. And he went through the list of all the people who were in favour of the European Constitution. The UMP, the Socialist Party, the Green Party, the Patronat, the Confederation of Industry, the main trade union Congress. There were, I think he said, 43 daily newspapers, and 42 of them were in favour, and the 43rd was neutral. He went through this whole list of how it was impossible to lose. And at the end I said, well, if that's the yes campaign, Hannan, then who is the no campaign? Who's against it? Oh, he said, the general population. And there, in one sentence, is the basic problem with the whole European project. It's about democracy. Such a good name. It's about, it doesn't matter whether you're left or right, it doesn't matter whether you're Dutch or British or French or German, it doesn't matter whether you're capitalist, socialist, liberal. It's about representative government. It's what they call in Brussels populism, right? Whenever there is a no vote in any referendum, which is, of course, whenever there is a referendum, I stand up and I say, why don't you respect the result? And they say, stop being so populist. It's the same word every time. Stop being so populist. Show some leadership. And I say, okay, populist, just to be clear that I've understood this. By populist, you mean a politician doing what his constituents want. Okay, in my country we call that democracy. But I understand where you're coming from. What happened in the immediate aftermath? I said what I learned about the Netherlands. This is what we learned about Brussels. What happened the day after your no vote? Jean-Claude Juncker stood up before me and my fellow MEPs and said, and this is where you really wonder at the guy's grip on reality, I do not believe that the people of France and the Netherlands voted no to the European Constitution. Great, Jean-Claude, that's nice. And it wasn't just something that he said in shock in the immediate aftermath of that result. He has carried on saying it for the intervening 10 years. Earlier this year, he managed to boil it down to an even pithier summary, an even shorter version of the same sentiment. He said, there can be no democratic choice against the European treaties. He was talking about the Greek election, but that could serve as the general slogan of the European Union. As Mr. Schäuble said also about the European treaties, the German finance minister, he put it even more succinctly, he said, elections change nothing. It's a tremendous myth that the European Union is founded in democracy. It is true that the individual 28 member states are parliamentary democracies. But it does not follow that the system they have created is democratic either in its structure or in its values. It's most obviously undemocratic in its structure. In what other forum in the world would you have executive and legislative power combined in the hands of 28 individuals? Let alone in the hands of 28 individuals who are invulnerable to public opinion because nobody can vote for or against them. There is an old joke in Brussels to the effect that if the EU were a country applying to join itself, it would be turned down because it was insufficiently democratic. We hear this a lot. You know, yes, it's true, the European Commission is undemocratic. You know what, my friends? It's worse than that. The European Commission, uniquely in human history, contrives to be anti-democratic in the sense that you generally get to go there after you've lost an election. So it's only like all of our commissioners, Mandelson and Patton and Kinnock, it's only when you've been expressly rejected by your voters that you are invited to come and legislate for them. Anyway, the classic example of this being the current president of the European Commission, who was appointed immediately after being thrown out of office by the people of Luxembourg, having run the Grand Duchy for some 17 and a half years. But it's not just that the Commission is undemocratic, it's not just that the EU is not an accountable or open system. There's a reason why they have this readiness to swat aside referendum results which they find inconvenient. Deep down, they don't believe that either democracy or freedom or the dots and commas of the treaty should be allowed to stand in the way of deeper integration. The cause for them is everything. The end justifies the means. Some of them are true believers. Some of them have just learned how to do very well out of the system. In some ways, I'm reminded of the Warsaw Pact countries, Kirk in 1980. There were one or two people who still believed in Marxism-Leninism. There were many more who understood that they were doing very nicely as apparatchiks in that system. But the one thing that they all had in common is that they didn't contemplate for a moment allowing the people to decide whether they wanted to keep it going. Now, if you think that I'm overdoing this, if you think that that is too strong a parallel, cast your minds back to what happened at the end of 2011, when in Italy and in Greece we saw Brussels-backed coups, civilian coups, in which elected prime ministers were toppled and replaced by Brussels apparatchiks who had never stood for office. In the case of Greece, Lucas Papadimos, former vice president of the European Central Bank. In the case of Italy, Mario Monti, former vice president of the European Commission. Neither man had ever invited his fellow countrymen to express a view on whether he should be elected. They both headed what were called national governments. But these were governments put together for the sole purpose of pushing through changes that would have been rejected by the nation in a general election. If you like, it was the culmination of the logic of the whole European project. Apparatchiks in Brussels were able to rule directly through apparatchiks in Rome and Athens. The people and their elected representatives were cut completely out of the picture. That's the first great myth about the European Union, the idea that it's founded in democracy. And that's why it is so heartening to see you, ladies and gentlemen, gathered here in the name of democracy to propose something better. I want to run through 4 more myths of the European Union, because I can't think of a system other than perhaps that of the old nomenclatura, based on such a mismatch between what is claimed and what is. So if myth number 1 is that the EU is based on democracy, myth number 2 is that the European Union is a successful free trade area. What's the phrase that the Brussels propagandists keep using? The biggest internal market in the world. Right? Now, as you're going to hear in a moment from my friend Gu, it is not a free trade area at all. It is a customs union. Now that may sound like a technical distinction, but believe me, it's absolutely critical. The difference between a free trade area and a customs union is this. A free trade area is a group of states that have chosen to eliminate tariffs and non-tariff barriers on the goods and services between them. They generally try and establish a market based on mutual product recognition. And an example of a free trade area is NAFTA or ASEAN, or indeed, which we're going to hear about in a moment, EFTA, the European Free Trade Association. The customs union does something else. It absorbs the commercial policies of all of the member states. It erects a common tariff wall around the outside. And so although it reduces customs tariffs internally, it replaces them with a common external tariff. That's what the European Union has done. Now, it's very unusual in being an international customs union. Most customs unions happen when one country is in effect administering another. Okay, there is a customs union between Swaziland and South Africa. There is a customs union between Israel and the occupied part of the West Bank. It's a very unusual thing to have sovereign nations following this model. Why does it matter? Why is this distinction so important? I'll tell you why. Because Europe is now the only part of the world that is experiencing no economic growth. And so the inability of a naturally free trading country like the Netherlands or the United Kingdom to sign independent commercial accords with countries outside the European Union has never mattered as much as it does today. Last year, Iceland and Switzerland signed free trade agreements with China. Okay, they're fully in the single market, they're fully covered by the European Free Trade Association, free movement of people and capital and goods and services, but they're not in the customs union. They can and do pursue trade deals abroad. China grew at 6.6% last year. The European Union shrank by 0.1%, the Eurozone shrank by 0.9%. I would say that's a fairly big advantage in the current climate. Last year, the EU announced that it was shelving its free trade talks with India. But EFTA has said that it expects to sign a comprehensive free trade agreement with India this year. India grew at 4.6% last year. The European Union, to remind you, shrank by 0.1%. The Eurozone shrank by 0.9%. My friends, we have this in common as Dutch and British people. We don't sit on huge natural resources, either in your country or in mine. We have always been maritime people, trading people. We have to make our way in the world by what we buy and sell. That means we have to be where the customers are. And with every day that passes, there are fewer and fewer customers in Europe. And as long as we are held back by the collective protectionism of the EU, as long as we are unable to sign properly liberal trade deals because it upsets textile workers in Italy or filmmakers in France or farmers in Poland, we are not able to exploit the opportunities that come on a planet. Well, you know, I made a joke a few months ago. I said every continent is experiencing economic growth except Antarctica and Europe. And a Spanish friend of mine sent me a cross email. And as I read through his figures, I had to accept that I was wrong and he was right. Antarctica's doing fine. Ships are returning, and the Antarctican economy is rebounding. We are trapped in the world's only shrinking customs union. That is no place for a trading nation like this one. And why? Why is it the world's only shrinking customs union? Well, this brings me on to myth number two. Myth number three. Myth number one is that it's democratic. Myth number two, it's a successful free trade area. Myth number three, that it bolsters trade and competition internally, right? That it's created a single market. Now again, it's important to be clear about the language. What most people understand by a free market is mutual product recognition, okay? If I can sell this microphone in the UK, then I should be able to sell it in France, Germany, and Italy, and vice versa. Right? If I can sell a bottle of mineral water in the Netherlands, I can sell the same bottle of mineral water in Poland, Greece. That's not what the EU means by single market. What it means is single regulatory regime. It means that in order to sell that bottle of mineral water, it has to contain the following minerals, but it mustn't contain any of these. The volume has to be not greater than X, but not less than Y. And you can frequently find that even a small firm that did no overseas trade, that was a wholly domestic company, finds its product criminalized. Why? Where does this regulatory drive come from? Well, I'll tell you, I've noticed this over the 16 years that I've been in the European Parliament. When you see some apparently pointless piece of regulation imposing unnecessary standards, almost always you find some company in Europe or some cartel of companies who happen to meet all of those specifications anyway, and who see Brussels as a wonderful vehicle, allowing them to export their costs to their competitors. I'll give you one example, which I got involved with because of my wife. This was the EU's ban on a number of vitamin and mineral supplements and herbal remedies. I'm sure that there will be a range of views in this room about the efficacy of alternative medicines and herbal remedies. For what it's worth, there is a difference of view in the Hannan household about the efficacy of herbal remedies. My wife thinks that they're wonderful, much, much better than conventional medicine. I tend to think that they are harmless placebos. But what is it that King Solomon says? It is better a dish of bitter herbs in a house where there is love than a stalled ox and hatred therewith. And maybe never did the bit about the dish of herbs apply quite so literally as in this case of my disagreement with Mrs. H about herbal remedies. But look, maybe they work, maybe they don't. What they plainly don't do is kill people, right? There's such a thing as a benefit of the doubt. No herbalist sets out to poison her customers. It's a bad business model. You know about these things, you clever Dutch people, right? You don't go around murdering the people who might buy from you. It closes you down after a while, even if you're not sued. So where did this bizarre impetus come from to regulate and in some cases close down a harmless activity pursued by 20 million Europeans? Well, I'm sure you can all guess the answer. The people lobbying for it quite openly, to be fair to them, they didn't disguise it, they registered what they were doing, were the big pharmaceutical corporations who saw a wonderful opportunity to extend costs that they could easily assimilate to smaller rivals who couldn't. Sure enough, many of those small companies have since closed down. This myth number 3, I think, is the single biggest lie about the European Union, the idea that it's about markets. My friends, there is a difference between being pro-business and being pro-market. Sometimes those two positions happen to coincide, and sometimes they don't. The European Union might credibly claim to be pro-business, or at least pro-big business. It cannot claim to be pro-markets. Again and again, it is used as a vehicle to restrict consumer choice and raise prices in the interests of some of these large cartels and corporates. Oh, and they do their bit. You know, when they're asked for the payback, as in the UK referendum, they come right out and they fund the campaign to stay in, and they come out and they make the argument about how vital it is. Right? Our Confederation of British Industry, which is part funded by the European Union, has been saying, oh, it will be a disaster to come out, all the same stuff that you heard during your referendum here. I remember, was it Mr. Brinkhorst saying that if you voted no, the lights would go out. And so far, at least, it doesn't look to me like it's happened. But it happens in every single referendum. All the establishment come out and tell you what a catastrophe, what an unthinkable calamity it would be to vote against. You know? They said exactly the same thing about if we kept the pound. The same people, not just the same kinds of people like the CBS, exactly the same individuals. If you don't join the euro, there will be disinvestment, there'll be unemployment, there'll be mass inflation, the stock exchange will collapse. Yeah, how's that working out for you guys? I mean, come on. And yet, without a blush, the same people use the same flawed logic today. Last week we had the UK branch of Airbus saying, oh, we must stay in the European Union, you know, which was curious, because the year before, in other words, before this referendum began, before the Davos men started twisting arms, the chief executive of Airbus said, oh, trade depends on profits, it doesn't depend on political union. He said we trade just as easily with Russian companies, with US companies. It doesn't require any political deal in Brussels. Now that's a kind of statement of the obvious, right? So why are they now hinting, of course not actually threatening, that would commit them to something, but vaguely trying to sow the doubt, to create the impression that if Britain left the EU, there might be less investment? Well, 5 minutes on the EU's register of lobbyists tells me that Airbus employs 10 full-time lobbyists and has spent £500,000 in Brussels trying to get rules that suit it. So ask yourself, does suiting a company like that with more regulation help the consumer, help the startup, or boost the European economy? Is it any wonder that we are falling further and further behind as a continent, falling even behind Antarctica, if we have an attitude based on barriers to entry and on deterring new entrants? Myth number 4. The EU is necessary in a networked world. It allows us to collaborate. It allows us to achieve collectively what we can't achieve singly. One easy way of dealing with that is to say, where are the wealthiest and most successful people on the planet? I mean, if size were what counted, if you had to be part of a big bloc in order to succeed, then China would be wealthier than Hong Kong, and Russia would be wealthier than Estonia, and Indonesia would be wealthier than Brunei, and the EU, for that matter, would be wealthier than Switzerland. In fact, what are the richest countries in Europe? Norway and Switzerland. It's telling you something. Spot the connection. And if you look at where the wealthiest people on the planet live, it is generally in tiny territories. In the UAE, in the Channel Islands, in Monaco. Okay, you could say, oh yeah, well, they're tax havens. Right, why did they become tax havens? They became tax havens because they had low taxes. And why do they have low taxes? Because they're small, because they don't have the duplication, the bureaucracy, and the remoteness of government that comes in a big bloc like the European Union. It's just not true that you need to be part of a large bloc in order to flourish. And it is certainly not true that you have to go through Brussels in order to collaborate with the countries around you. There's this extraordinary idea that the alternative to the European Union is some kind of atomized world, some anarchy where no country ever talks to any other. We're told this over and over again. You point to any Brussels policy that is wasteful, that is corrupt, and you're always told, but the nature of this policy is cross-border, and therefore we need a common European policy. So I was listening yesterday to Ken Clarke, the great British Europhile, defending the common fisheries policy by saying the fish don't recognise national borders. He tells us this as though it's an original insight of his. Really, Ken? You mean they swim around? Who'd have thought it? Yeah. There you go. Yes, of course it's true that the fish don't recognise international borders. Of course the fish don't carry passports, for goodness sake. We know that. And yet everywhere else, countries with fish stocks manage to reach sensible bilateral or multilateral deals with each other. So that if the fish are spawning in the waters of country A, but are growing to maturity in the waters of country B, countries A and B get together and they work out a quota system. And this is what Iceland does, it's what New Zealand does, it's what the Falkland Islands do. It's just not true that you need to have bureaucrats in Brussels telling you how to do this. And in fact, when you invite the bureaucrats in Brussels to come and tell you how to do it, you end up, as we have done in the North Sea, with no fish. Because if you make something an equal access common resource, then the wisdom of Aristotle holds true: that which no one owns, no one cares for. And the EU has therefore created precisely the catastrophe that it was supposedly defending against. But we're told this again and again. There's this huge push to harmonise criminal justice, policing and civil law all over the EU. And again, it's the same stupid justification we're given every time. Yeah, crime is cross-border. Yeah, so it is. And you know what? Long before there was any European Union, here in The Hague we had Interpol, we had the extradition treaties, we recognised time spent in another country's prison as part of your sentence. You had a full network of police and judicial cooperation which was international, not just European. That was the alternative to Europol and Eurojust. Not some anarchy, but a tried and trusted system of collaboration among sovereign democracies. Think of how many examples of international cooperation we take for granted, that we don't even notice. Think of the little miracle that happens when you post a letter by airmail. Okay? You buy your stamp here. You hand your money over to the Dutch post office, and yet you're reasonably confident that that letter is going to be accurately delivered in South Africa or Mexico or wherever it is you've sent it to. Right? Now, there's no Parliament to do this, there's no European Commission to do this, there's no Court of Justice. It rests on a bilateral deal or a multilateral deal among sovereign states that has applied since the 1840s. You find me one EU policy that is as reliable as the airmail system, or the dividing up of international dial codes or internet domain names or any of these things. You don't need Brussels to make different countries work together. And in fact, what we find very often is that at the global level, where the decisions really count, where the standardization is determined, whether it's to do with food, Codex Alimentarius, whether it's to do with banking rules, you name it, instead of having a Dutch or a British seat around the table, we are all represented by the European Commission. So when, at those real top tables, the decisions that matter are being made, the Norwegians sit there, their 5 million people buys them one place, 8 million Swiss, they get one place, 230,000 Icelanders, or however many, maybe they've been breeding since I was last there, they get one, but the whole European Union, all 28 member states, are represented by the European Commission. Now, I would say that that is not a way of maximising our influence, either collectively or singly. And then the last one, myth number 5. This is the last-ditch defence of the Euro integrationist. It's all about peace. And they use this argument with a flagrancy and a belligerence that is remarkably unpacific. In the run-up to the referendum, whose anniversary we mark today, Commissioner Wallström of Sweden was speaking on the anniversary of the liberation of the concentration camp at Terezin in the Czech Republic. It had been Theresienstadt when it was a German concentration camp. And she said something truly extraordinary. Addressing the French and Dutch electorates on the eve of the two referendums, she said, there are people who think that intergovernmental cooperation is enough, who resist the supranational model for Europe. Those people should come to Terezin and see where that road leads. Now, there are many observations to be made about Mrs. Wallström's remarks, beyond the obvious one that she was wrong. You did vote no, the French voted no, and so far, thank God, there has been no Holocaust and no renewal of the Second World War in Europe. But think of what she was saying. If you hold up European integration as the only alternative to mass murder, you're giving yourself quite a lot of leeway, aren't you? You could have a system that was pretty corrupt, pretty expensive, pretty undemocratic, but it would still be better than the alternative, right? And that is the basic flaw of the peace argument. It allows you to silence all opposition by saying, I alone stand between Europe and a renewal of the horrors of the Second World War. I have to tell you, there is no evidence at all that the European Union has in fact been a guarantor of peace or stability. Ask yourselves this question. Was the EU really the cause of peace in Europe after 1956? Or isn't it more accurate to think of the European Union as a consequence of a European peace born out of the defeat of fascism, the spread of democracy, and the stability of the NATO alliance? Let me ask the question another way. Think of all of the parts of the world where there are conflicts today. Okay? South Sudan, Macedonia, Israel-Palestine, Kashmir, Chechnya. How many of those conflicts are caused by, so to speak, people feeling that they belong to the wrong country, or that they have no loyalty to the state into which they've been conscripted. Does it make sense to jam different peoples together in the hope that that will make them get on better? Or doesn't history suggest that the best model is to have democratic, peaceful, bourgeois democracies living alongside one another, respecting their differences, each answerable to their own democratic institutions and mechanisms? Or if that's too general a way of putting the question, let's drag it back to Europe. Okay? The most ambitious integrationist project in the history of the European Union is the single currency. Now, look at what German newspapers are writing about Greece. And even more, look the other way around at what Greek newspapers are writing about Germans. Would you say that the euro is soothing or stoking national animosities in Europe? Does jamming these countries together make them get on better? Or does it in fact make them more stubborn, more difficult, and indeed more aggressive? I told you that I always visit your Rijksmuseum every time I'm in this city. The largest tableau in that extraordinary gallery is a huge panorama of the Battle of Waterloo by a Dutch painter called Jan Willem Pieneman. I think I've got his name right. It shows the moment when Crown Prince William is wounded, and Wellington is in the foreground, and the Prussians are just arriving. And what you see there is what sovereign nations coming together can achieve when they respect each other's freedom. The anniversary of Waterloo is 3 weeks away, 2.5 weeks away now. It marks a previous attempt to unite Europe in tyranny, with an external tariff wall around it, with a powerful bureaucracy, and with a contempt for the national principle and a contempt for the rights and freedoms of smaller countries. The battle that we are joined in is not a battle that pits one people against another, but rather that puts lovers of freedom and respecters of the patriotism of other countries all on the same side against this corporatist racket, this undemocratic system in Brussels. And so when you defend your interests as Dutch patriots, you are also speaking up for the freedom of every other people in Europe. Nothing could be more false than the idea that patriotism makes you look down on another country. The reverse is true. The best kind of patriot is the one who respects the freedom of all friendly peoples. It's our patriotism that makes us behave unselfishly, that makes us recognize an obligation to the people around us. It's our patriotism that makes us pay taxes to support strangers, that makes us obey laws even when we think they're stupid laws, that makes us accept election results even when our party has lost. That's the basis of European civilization, one that respects the pluralism, the diversity, the variety that enriched, ennobled, and elevated this continent. We, my friends, are the true Europeans, not those who have stolen that name in order to hatch this plot of centralizing the whole continent in autocracy. We can do better. We can replace this racket with a different kind of Europe, one based on free markets, free nations, and free people.